Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. You have probably seen this scenario play out before. The org chart looks clean, the governance model is officially approved, and the architecture deck is incredibly sharp. Teams is buzzing with activity, SharePoint is packed with files, and Copilot sits right at the top of the digital roadmap. But despite all those green lights, the day-to-day work still feels slow, repetitive, and strangely unclear to the people doing it. Because if you look closely, leaders are often managing an organization that exists only on paper rather than the one that actually operates. I want to show you exactly where that gap shows up inside Microsoft 365 and why it changes how we should think about structure, performance, and transformation. The organization leaders think they run. Most leaders believe they are running a formal organization, and to be fair, that perspective makes perfect sense from the top down. They see a clear org chart with defined reporting lines, and they rely on governance forums, steering groups, and approval models to keep things moving. They look at process maps, architecture diagrams, and role descriptions as the definitive truth of how the business functions. All of that structure matters, and I am certainly not saying it doesn't. Formal design serves a vital purpose because it creates accountability and defines ownership while reducing ambiguity at the level of intent. Without those guardrails, you don't really have an organization, you just have a collection of noise. But here is the thing we often overlook. Formal design is not the same as operating reality, and while it tells you how the organization is supposed to work, it rarely tells you how work actually moves through the system. And why is that? The reason is that leaders naturally optimize what is visible, measurable, and officially approved. They focus on what shows up in slide decks, what can be reviewed in governance meetings, and what can be explained in quarterly business language. They prioritize what can be assigned to a named function, so the organization becomes legible through artifacts like boxes, lines, committees, and maturity models. That process creates a very persuasive management fiction. It isn't exactly a lie, but it functions more like an abstraction that people eventually mistake for the thing itself. Abstractions are useful tools for navigation until you start managing only the abstraction and lose sight of the ground. I have seen this happen in organizations that looked extremely coherent from the outside. They had a clear digital workplace strategy, strong Microsoft 365 governance, and well-defined collaboration standards for everything from naming conventions to SharePoint patterns. They had security controls and executive alignment that would make any auditor happy, representing everything you would want to see if you were assessing maturity. But underneath that polished surface, the daily experience of work was something else entirely. People were constantly waiting for feedback, checking with others for permission, and searching across disconnected spaces for information they couldn't find. They were recreating documents they knew already existed somewhere in the system, and they were escalating issues through personal relationships instead of following the official process. They were trying to move decisions across a structure that looked organized, but simply didn't behave that way. From a system perspective, that gap matters more than most leaders realize, because once strategy is translated into operating assumptions, every decision starts depending on a picture of the organization that may no longer be true. You might think ownership sits in one specific place, but the actual context needed to make a decision sits somewhere else. You might think approval follows a formal path, but the real unblocker is often a person completely outside the chain of command. You think knowledge is being shared because it is stored in a folder, but storage is not the same thing as shared understanding. The same logic applies to engagement, where you might think collaboration is healthy because activity levels are high, but high activity is often just structural compensation for a broken process. That is the real risk here. Leaders are often making design decisions based on structural assumptions instead of behavioral evidence. And the more coherent the formal model looks, the easier it becomes to miss the fragmentation hidden underneath. That is the trap we fall into. A clean diagram creates a sense of confidence, and that confidence quickly reduces curiosity. Reduced curiosity is dangerous when the real organization has already drifted away from the formal one. And organizations always drift quietly. This drift doesn't happen through a dramatic collapse, but through 1,000 small adjustments made by employees just trying to get their jobs done. It looks like a workaround here, a private channel there, or a copied file that bypasses the official library. It shows up as an inherited permission or an informal decision path that works faster than the approved one. None of those things look strategic when you see them in isolation, but together they form the actual operating model of the company. If leadership never looks at that level, the organization they believe they manage becomes less and less connected to the one actually producing business outcomes. This is exactly where a lot of transformation work starts to fail. It isn't because the tools are wrong or because the people inside the system are resisting change, but because the intervention is aimed at the documented organization while the actual friction lives in the behavioral ones. So when leaders say they already have governance or they have already clarified ownership, what they usually mean is that the formal design exists. What they have not yet confirmed is whether the operating behavior actually follows it. That distinction changes everything about how we lead. Hierarchy explains who is accountable, but behavior explains how things are executed. If you want to understand why work feels slow inside an organization that looks mature, you have to stop looking only at the structure that was designed and start looking at the one that emerged. Because at the end of the day, that is the organization that actually runs the business. The organization that actually exists. So what is the organization that actually exists? It is definitely not the one you'll find in the corporate slide deck, because the real organization is expressed through the behavior inside the tools people use every day. That is the real shift we need to acknowledge. If we want to understand organizational reality, we have to stop asking how the company is structured in principle and start asking how work actually gets done in practice. Who asks whom before taking action, and where does a document start before it inevitably gets copied? You have to look at which approval step looks formal, but is really just a delay while everyone waits for one specific trusted person to respond. We need to see where work stalls and where the actual context lives. When the official path is too slow, where do people go instead? That is the real organization, and it is usually far more visible than leaders think. You can see it in decision paths and access patterns, but you also see it in duplicated content and informal escalation loops. It shows up in side chats, local trackers, and files renamed Final V7 Actual because the formal system failed. The same few people get pulled into everything because they hold context that the formal structure never bothered to distribute. Now, this is important because most organizations still try to explain themselves through a rigid hierarchy. Hierarchy matters because it tells you who is accountable and where authority is meant to sit, but hierarchy does not explain execution. Execution is behavioral, and it emerges from how information moves, how trust is formed, and how people compensate when the formal path doesn't match the speed of the business. That's why so many frustrations that sound personal are not personal at all. Confusion, delay, and dependency are often just system outcomes. When people say they don't know who owns a project or that they need to check with 3 people before moving, that isn't just poor discipline. It is the organization revealing its actual shape, and the real shape is rarely clean. It emerges through repetition, which means a repeated question tells you exactly where clarity is missing. A repeated handoff shows you where ownership is weak, and a repeated file copy proves that trust in the original source is low. When you see a repeated escalation, it tells you the formal process cannot carry the operational pressure of the business. So the actual organization is not made of departments alone, but is instead made of the movement of messages, files, approvals, and access. Once you start looking there, a very different picture appears. You find that some people outside the official chain shape key outcomes because they sit at a knowledge bottleneck. Some teams collaborate constantly, not because they are aligned, but because they are forced to reconcile fragmented information over and over again. You might find that a formally senior role matters less in execution than a person with the right permissions or the right history. This is why I keep coming back to one idea. The organization is not what it says about itself, it is what its behavior produces. Behavior is not random, as it follows incentives, constraints, interfaces, and design. When we see rework, uncertainty, or a dependence on heroics, we should stop treating those as isolated performance issues. They are structural signals. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. It's just not aligned with the story leadership is telling. That gap matters even more now because modern work leaves traces. In Microsoft 365, people are constantly generating evidence of how the business really operates. This isn't theory, it's telemetry found in collaboration, behavior, and document movement. We no longer have to guess where the real organization is because we can observe it and map it. We can finally test whether the formal design and the operating reality still match. When they don't, that mismatch explains what leaders call culture problems or change resistance. Very often, it's not resistance first, but structural compensation. People are simply adapting to a design that doesn't support the work as it really happens. Which brings me to the first signal, one that almost every leadership team already owns, but very few read correctly. What shows up in teams is usually not a clean story of collaboration, but a pressure map. Signal 1. Teams shows coordination pressure, not collaboration health. Let's start with teams, because this is where a lot of leaders make the wrong read. They open the admin view or hear the adoption update, and the numbers sound reassuring. High usage and plenty of channel activity make it seem like the organization is healthy from the surface. But here's where it gets interesting. Teams is not just a collaboration tool, it is a coordination layer. Coordination layers become noisy when the underlying organization is fragmented. If you want to understand what Teams is really telling you, don't just ask whether people are active. Ask what kind of activity the environment is forcing. High activity can mean the organization is working in sync, or it can mean the organization is spending energy compensating for a weak structure. Those are very different realities, and most dashboards don't tell you the difference by default. To make this practical, when I look at Teams, I'm not mainly interested in whether usage is up. I'm looking for structural clues like how many teams exist relative to the actual work model and where private channels start multiplying. I want to see how often people fall back to chat instead of shared spaces and whether message density is creating clarity or just traffic. A well-designed collaboration environment should reduce coordination effort by lowering the amount of checking, chasing, and clarifying people need to do. If Teams activity keeps rising while work still feels unclear, the platform is not showing healthy flow. It's showing pressure. Take team and channel sprawl as an example. On paper, lots of teams can look like engagement, but in practice, it often means the organization keeps creating new containers instead of resolving ownership problems. A new team gets created because the existing one is too broad, and then a private channel appears because people don't trust the wider space. Eventually, a side chat becomes the real decision space because the formal channel is too noisy or too slow. The visible environment keeps expanding while shared context keeps shrinking. That's the pattern. More spaces, but less coherence. Private channels are especially revealing here. I'm not saying they are bad, as sometimes they are the right design choice, but when they multiply across functions, they tell you trust is uneven, ownership is unclear, and cross-team work feels operationally unsafe in the open, so people create protected coordination pockets. From a system perspective, that's not just a preference, it's an adaptation. The environment is producing behavior that roots around friction. The same thing shows up in chat. If decisions repeatedly happen in one-to-one chats instead of shared channels, it usually means the shared environment is not trusted as an execution layer. Maybe it's too noisy or the right people are missing, but whatever the reason, behavior is telling you the formal space is not carrying the real work. Then there's message density, which is one of the easiest signals to misread. A high volume of messages can look like momentum, but often it means people are burning effort on alignment that should have been built into the design. You see a lot of people checking who owns a task or which version of a file is current. That is not collaboration excellence. It is structural compensation happening at scale. The organization is working hard to recreate clarity in real time because the operating model didn't provide enough of it upfront. When leaders celebrate high Teams engagement without asking what that engagement is doing, they miss the actual signal. More activity can mean more uncertainty, and more conversation can mean weaker interfaces. Teams doesn't just show whether people are talking, it shows how much coordination load the organization is carrying to keep work moving. Once you start seeing Teams that way, the platform stops looking like proof of maturity and starts looking like an operational stress indicator. This brings me to the next signal because conversation pressure is only part of the picture. If you want to see how fragmentation hardens into organizational memory, you have to look at where knowledge starts to split, and that usually shows up in SharePoint and OneDrive. Why high activity usually means the system is working harder than it should. Now map that reality to how we work today. A busy collaboration environment creates a convincing appearance of flow because messages move, meetings happen, and notifications fire all day long. People respond quickly, and there is visible motion everywhere, which leads many leaders to mistake this constant activity for genuine progress. But here's the thing. Activity is not the same as throughput, and it is definitely not the same as clarity. A healthy operating model should remove unnecessary coordination by allowing people to act with enough context, trust, and ownership that work moves without constant social repair. When that structure is missing, the gap gets rebuilt manually through endless pings and check-ins. That is what high activity often represents. It is manual structural compensation. The system is working harder than it should because the design forces people to carry a load that the environment should be carrying for them. You can hear this structural failure in the language people use every day. They say things like, "I just want to double check," or "let me ask them first before we move." They ask if anyone has the latest version or if legal has already weighed in, and they insist on aligning before anything is sent out. While that sounds responsible, and sometimes it is, it tells a different story when it becomes the normal operating rhythm. It reveals that the system does not provide enough confidence for people to move, so that confidence has to be recreated through conversation over and over again. This is where many organizations accidentally celebrate the wrong signals by praising responsiveness and collaboration intensity. They love how connected everyone seems, but if people need constant touch points just to avoid making mistakes, then that connection is a load signal rather than a strength signal. The organization has not actually reduced dependency. It has simply normalized it. And why is that? It happens because repeated alignment conversations usually point to a failure in how dependencies are designed. The work is not modular enough, the interfaces are not clear, and the ownership boundaries are too weak to stand on their own. When the source of truth is not trusted, you don't get clean execution, you get human middleware. You find people translating between teams and carrying context across boundaries to stitch together decisions that the operating model should have made easy. That is why checking with others is so misleading. It gets framed as teamwork, but structurally it is often a workaround for a weak information flow. A person isn't asking for help because collaboration is inherently valuable in that specific moment. They are asking because the system failed to give them the certainty they needed to proceed alone. That distinction matters because if leaders interpret this as positive collaboration, they will keep scaling the wrong pattern. They add more syncs, more channels, and more approval loops, which only increases the latency of the entire operation. This doesn't happen in one dramatic collapse, but rather in thousands of micro delays, where a message waits 30 minutes or a meeting gets pushed to tomorrow. A file gets reviewed one more time for safety, and a side call happens before the formal update, but then another clarification is needed because the side call never made it back into the shared space. This is how slow organizations hide. They don't look slow, they look incredibly busy. Decision latency is hard to see because it accumulates in the gaps between visible actions, like the space between a message and an answer, or the time between a decision and the final version. The cost is spread across hundreds of tiny pauses, so nobody names it as a structural issue, even though everyone experiences the work as heavy. Over time, people adapt to that heaviness by building habits around it. They copy more people on emails, create pre-meetings for the actual meetings, and store local versions of files to avoid waiting on a slow system. They rely on trusted individuals instead of trusted environments. And while that adaptation keeps the business functioning, it also hides the underlying design failure. From a system perspective, a lot of modern knowledge work isn't execution at all. It is coordination overhead generated by a poor structural fit. The platform is active because the organization is laboring just to stay coherent, not because coherence already exists. Once you understand that, high activity stops looking reassuring and starts looking expensive. It is expensive in time, attention, and decision speed, and it drains leadership confidence because everyone feels the drag while the formal structure insists everything is aligned. But here's the real consequence. When coordination load stays high for too long, people stop trusting shared knowledge. They stop assuming the answer is already in the environment and start recreating it themselves. That is exactly where collaboration pressure turns into knowledge fragmentation. Signal 2, SharePoint and OneDrive, reveal how knowledge actually moves. Now we get to the second signal, because once coordination pressure gets high enough, people stop relying on shared conversation alone and start protecting themselves with content. This usually shows up in SharePoint and OneDrive, which is where many organizations think they are safe. The files are in Microsoft 365, the libraries exist, and the naming standards might even look good on paper. From a governance view, knowledge appears to be under control, but storage is not the same as shared understanding. If you want to see how knowledge actually moves, you have to stop asking where files are stored and start asking how often they are copied or renamed just to make work possible. That is the real signal. Knowledge doesn't just break down when information is missing. It breaks down when information exists in too many places with too many versions and no clear ownership. You might find a document in a SharePoint library, another copy in a project site, a version in someone's OneDrive, and an attachment in a Teams chat. Then someone builds a deck that reuses parts of all of them, but no one is fully sure which source was actually final. From a system perspective, that isn't just untidy content management, it is evidence of low trust in the environment's ability to preserve context. People copy knowledge closer to where they need it because that is a rational, local behavior. If finding the right file takes too long or a shared space feels unreliable, the fastest move is to duplicate what you need and keep going. And the problem is that this local efficiency creates enterprise fragmentation where every copy becomes a branch that creates interpretive risk. Every unclear version leads to one more conversation about what is current and what can be acted on, which is how knowledge multiplication becomes decision drag. You can see this in small patterns like weak metadata, disconnected libraries, and folders that only make sense to one specific team. You see historical files that stay available but aren't trustworthy, and ownership fields that are technically assigned but operationally meaningless. When you have a site full of documents but nobody knows which one carries authority, you don't have a content problem. You have an operating model problem. Authoritative knowledge requires a clear place, a clear owner, and enough trust that people don't feel the need to recreate it elsewhere. When one of those is missing, knowledge moves through duplication instead of through reference. That difference is massive because reference scales while duplication fragments. OneDrive is especially revealing here. I am not saying OneDrive is the problem, as it has a valid role, but when work that should live in shared spaces keeps getting anchored in personal storage, the organization is telling you something important. It is saying that shared environments are not fast or clear enough for the work as it really happens. People move from organizational memory to personal control not out of rebellion, but as an adaptation to a fragile environment. Now map that to AI, because this is where the stakes get much higher. Copilot does not reason over your intention. It reasons over accessible content, permissions, and context signals. If your SharePoint and OneDrive environment contains contradictory files and duplicated truth, AI does not remove that ambiguity. It operationalizes it. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do by surfacing what exists, but it cannot infer the structural clarity your organization failed to maintain. That is why SharePoint hygiene is not just cleanup work, it is essential infrastructure. It is a prerequisite for reliable memory and reliable AI outcomes. Once you see document movement this way, file duplication stops looking like user sloppiness and starts looking like a map of organizational mistrust. It shows who trusts the source, who copies to move faster, and who recreates because retrieval is too expensive. That is how knowledge actually moves inside the business. And it doesn't follow the architecture you documented. It follows the confidence patterns people build just to get their work done. But knowledge is not shared when it has to be recreated. This is where the phrase knowledge sharing starts to become misleading because in a lot of organizations, knowledge isn't actually being shared at all. It is being recreated on demand. While those two things might sound similar from a structural perspective, they are worlds apart. Shared knowledge means your system preserves context well enough that the next person can find it, trust it, and use it without rebuilding the answer from scratch. Recreated knowledge, on the other hand, means the system failed to preserve that confidence, forcing every team to reconstruct meaning locally. That is an expensive way to operate, yet the cost stays hidden because the output still appears. The deck gets finished, the proposal gets sent, and the decision eventually gets made, so from the outside it looks like the system worked perfectly. But if the same answer had to be rebuilt 3 times across 3 different spaces by 3 different groups, that isn't a flow of knowledge. That is organizational reprocessing. And why does this happen? Usually it comes down to 2 simple reasons: low confidence in retrieval and low confidence in others. If people don't trust that the right information can be found quickly, they copy it. If they don't trust that another team's version is complete, current, or usable, they rebuild it themselves. That behavior is rational, and it isn't a discipline problem first, it's a system outcome. I see this play out all the time in cross-functional work. A team needs to move fast, so they pull a file into their own workspace and adjust it for their specific context. Then someone else asks for the same thing and receives that local version instead of the original. Now you have 2 versions in motion. Eventually a third team adds comments in PowerPoint or exports a PDF into a chat because it feels safer, which means the content hasn't just been duplicated, it has forked. Every fork carries a different level of trust, and that creates a hidden tax on every future decision you make. Every search becomes a piece of interpretation work where you aren't just looking for a file but trying to decode its lineage. You have to ask which one came first, which one was approved, and which one reflects the latest assumptions or still carries authority. If nobody can answer those questions quickly, people default to something even more expensive. They start asking around. Document fragmentation creates conversation overhead, and that overhead creates decision latency. That's the chain. This is also why historical content becomes so dangerous in mature Microsoft 365 environments. The documents are still there, search returns something, and the libraries look populated, but accessibility is not the same thing as reliability. An old document that stays visible but is no longer trustworthy adds ambiguity rather than clarity. It gives the appearance of memory without the actual function of memory. From a system perspective, that's fragile because decisions now depend on whether individuals can personally distinguish useful history from outdated residue. That does not scale. Once Copilot enters the picture, this weakness gets exposed even faster. Copilot works with whatever the environment makes available, using accessible files, metadata, permissions, and the surrounding context. If your environment contains multiple contradictory versions of the same business truth, Copilot cannot magically resolve the governance failure underneath. It can summarize the mess, surface the contradiction faster, and package uncertainty in fluent language, but it cannot invent authority where none exists. That is a critical point leaders need to understand. Low-quality AI output is often not an AI quality problem first. It is an organizational memory problem. The model is grounding itself in an environment where ownership is blurred, lineage is weak, and duplication has replaced confidence. So when a leader tells me that Copilot gave them something inconsistent, I'd ask a different question. What exactly was the system allowed to reason over? If the content layer is fragmented, the intelligence will be fragmented too. The reason is simple. AI amplifies the operating reality it inherits. It does not compensate for structural ambiguity, it just makes that ambiguity more visible. That visibility is actually useful if we read it correctly. Duplication is not random noise, but a measurable signal that the organization does not trust its own knowledge infrastructure enough to reuse it cleanly. People recreate answers when the cost of finding and trusting the original becomes too high. Every duplicate file is evidence of a boundary failure, an ownership failure, and a failure of trust. If knowledge has to be recreated to be useful, it isn't really shared. It's being manually regenerated inside a system that stores information but fails to preserve meaning. Which brings me to the next layer, because once knowledge becomes unstable, access becomes even more important. In many organizations, access tells you more about the real structure than titles ever will. Signal 3, identity and permission drift, define the real org. Now we get to the third signal, and in a lot of organizations, this is the one that reveals the deepest truth: access. If Teams shows coordination pressure and SharePoint shows how knowledge fractures, then identity and permissions show who the organization actually depends on. This isn't about who the org chart says matters, but who can actually reach what matters. Most leaders still think of structure in terms of hierarchy, who reports to whom and who owns which function. But from an operating perspective, access often tells a much more honest story about who can see the file, open the site, or retrieve the history. It shows who can approve the flow, unblock the issue, or who still has the admin rights that nobody cleaned up 2 reorganizations ago. That is the real organization expressing itself through reach. Work does not move through titles alone. It moves through available context. If someone has the context, the permissions, and the trust to act, they will shape outcomes whether the formal structure acknowledges it or not. This is why Entra ID and Microsoft Graph matter so much here. They don't just describe identity in a technical sense, they expose operational reach. Group membership, inherited access, and abandoned owners all become part of the real organizational design. You see old project groups still granting visibility into current work and security groups that outlived the structure they were created for. Guest access that was temporary in theory often becomes permanent in practice, even if nobody intended for that to happen. This is where permission drift becomes so important. Permission drift is what happens when the access model keeps evolving through local decisions, but nobody steps back to ask if it still matches the business reality. A person changes roles but keeps their historical access, or a team is dissolved but the group remains active. A site owner leaves and ownership is never properly reassigned, or a workaround becomes permanent because removing it feels too risky. One exception becomes 10, then 50, and suddenly the environment is carrying the fossil record of past decisions and old trust assumptions. The current org chart says one thing, but the access layer says something else entirely. From a system perspective, that divergence is not minor. It changes who actually holds power. Power in modern organizations is often less about formal rank and more about control over access, interpretation, and release. The person who can surface the right file at the right time matters. The person who can confirm what is current, grant entry, or unblock a workflow matters. Very often those people sit outside the visible hierarchy that leadership thinks is governing execution. That's why permission reviews are not just a compliance exercise, they are a structural audit. They tell you where the business still depends on individuals, hidden pathways, and unexamined inheritance. They show you exactly where access has become decoupled from accountability. Once access and accountability diverge, fragility goes up fast. The people responsible for outcomes are not always the people who can actually move the work, which creates delay and escalation. It creates a very specific kind of confusion where people say they are supposed to own something but can't get what they need. Or the reverse happens, where someone isn't meant to be involved anymore, but everyone still comes to them because they are the only ones who can see the history. That is not just awkward role design, it's a system outcome. The system is preserving old organizational logic in the access layer long after leadership believes the organization has changed. So when we say the real org is defined by access, this is what we mean. It's not that hierarchy disappears, but that operational reality is shaped by who can reach information and act without waiting. That is often a better map of the business than the org chart itself. Once you overlay that with teams' behavior and content duplication, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You're no longer looking at noise, you're looking at the hidden structure the business actually runs on. Access patterns reveal power better than hierarchy, and this is where it becomes relevant for anyone responsible for systems. Once you stop looking at permissions as a boring IT hygiene issue and start reading them as an operating signal, you begin to see power differently. And I'm not talking about theoretical power or the kind people show off in slide decks. I'm talking about operational power, which is the specific force that determines whether work moves today or sits stuck until next week. In a formal hierarchy, we assume power sits with seniority because titles imply authority and job levels imply control. We look at escalation paths and see order, but in live enterprise systems, what matters is something far less visible. The real influence belongs to the people who can see, approve, retrieve, change, and unblock the flow of information. That is why access patterns often reveal power better than a hierarchy ever could. When a decision gets stuck, the person who matters most is rarely the one with the most elegant title on their LinkedIn profile. Instead, it is the person who can release the next step, the one with the historical context, or the person who knows where the file actually lives. They might be the only one who still has access to an old workspace, or the one who can validate if a number is current. Everyone quietly waits for this person before acting, and that is where the real power sits. If you look closely, organizations accumulate this kind of power in very uneven ways, and it usually happens by drift rather than by design. A platform owner gets copied into every email because they understand the logic behind the structure, while a long-tenured coordinator becomes the default router because nobody trusts the process without them. Sometimes a single manager keeps inherited permissions across multiple environments, which means every cross-functional issue eventually lands on their desk. From a system perspective, these are not just random dependencies, they are concentrated control points that make the organization dangerous. It is a single point of failure where one person carries too much context and informal approval authority. The organization might still function under stable conditions, but the moment that person leaves or becomes overloaded, the entire throughput of the business drops. This doesn't happen because the other people are incapable, but because the structure never distributed what the business actually depends on to survive. This is why I am very careful when I hear leaders use the language of key people to describe their best employees. They celebrate these individuals as high performers or glue people who hold everything together. And while they are often talented, we should ask a harder structural question. Why does the organization require glue in that exact place? And why does one person need to bridge what the design failed to connect? If one person holds the relationship map and the access rights, your performance is not resilient. It is concentrated, and concentration is risk. You can see this risk in everyday enterprise behavior when people bypass the formal queue to message one specific person directly. Approvals often wait for informal validation before anyone hits the submit button, and documents sit in shared spaces that nobody trusts until one known individual confirms they are correct. A workflow might exist on paper, but everyone knows who really decides whether it moves. This means your governance says one thing while your operational dependency says another, forcing leaders to manage an authority model that no longer matches business reality. This matters even more in Microsoft 365 environments because access is scalable and one permission decision can shape the behavior of hundreds of people. One legacy owner can become a bottleneck for an entire process, or one badly governed group can make sensitive information public to the wrong audience while the right people are still waiting for access. The access layer does not just reflect your structure, it actively produces it by shaping who becomes central and who becomes invisible. Once that pattern hardens, the org chart becomes less useful as an execution map because it explains reporting but no longer explains control. If structural resilience matters to you, then redundancy must matter too, which means you need more than one person with the right context and more than one path to retrieve knowledge. Otherwise, the business is not coordinated, it is dependent. Dependency hidden inside access design is one of the easiest ways to create fragility while still looking organized on the surface. When we overlay these signals, something important starts to happen that changes how we view the company. Teams shows us the coordination pressure, SharePoint shows the fragmentation of knowledge, and permissions show us where the real control sits. Once you see those three signals together, the real organization finally starts to come into focus. When you overlay activity, content, and access, the real org appears. This is the point where isolated symptoms stop looking like accidents and start looking like a system outcome. Any one of these signals on its own is easy to explain away as a minor issue. You might see high Teams activity and assume people are just engaged, or see duplicate files and blame them on bad habits. Even messy permissions can be dismissed as technical debt, but when you overlay activity, content, and access, the pattern becomes much harder to ignore. Now you are no longer looking at separate admin problems. You are looking at one operating model expressing itself through three different surfaces. That is when the real organization becomes legible and you see teams sprawl and message density for what they really are. You see duplicated documents and personal storage acting as fallback infrastructure because the official system failed. Then you see permission drift and access concentrated in the hands of people the org chart barely even acknowledges. When you put those pieces together, a very specific picture starts to emerge of high activity mixed with low clarity and hidden control points. That is not a mature organization with a few cleanup issues. It is a business running on workarounds that only look collaborative from a distance. I keep saying the real organization is visible through movement because messages, documents, and permissions capture how the company actually behaves under pressure. Formal processes describe how work is intended to flow, but telemetry shows how it actually flows. And the gap between those two is where the truth lives. If a decision path looks simple on a process map, but requires 15 chat messages and an unofficial approver to finish, then that map is just an aspiration. The operating model is the sequence that really happened, and once you accept that, a lot of familiar enterprise language starts to sound different. Collaboration might actually be a nice word for repeated reconciliation across fragmented teams, and flexibility might just mean people are routing around a weak structure. When leaders praise responsiveness, they might actually be seeing a few overloaded individuals holding the system together manually. This is not a failure of the people, it is a failure of how we read the design of the system. Leaders often mistake local adaptation for organizational health, but adaptation is not the same thing as resilience. Sometimes people adapt so well that they hide the real cost of the structure they are compensating for, which is why the overlay matters so much. Each signal validates the others. Teams tells you where the load is rising, content tells you where understanding is failing, and access tells you where authority has actually settled. Together, these signals reveal whether the organization is executing through designed flow or through accumulated compensation. In many enterprises, it is quiet, persistent, and expensive compensation that keeps the business moving through extra effort and constant waiting. This creates a dangerous illusion where the organization looks functional from the outside because people are active and work is getting delivered. The system appears stable only because the people inside it are carrying structural debt manually every single day. That distinction matters because if you automate on top of that debt, you don't remove it. You simply scale the problem. If you add AI on top of that mess, you don't create clarity. You just expose the existing ambiguity much faster than before. Many organizations are still trying to improve performance by optimizing single tools like cleaning up Teams or fixing SharePoint. While that is useful work, partial treatment often misses the combined behavior that drives the whole system. The real insight does not sit in the tool alone, but in the relationship between how conversation pressure creates duplication and how that duplication increases dependency on a few individuals. That is a loop, and loops are where system behavior becomes persistent and difficult to change. If you want to understand the real organization, don't just inspect one platform at a time. Instead, overlay the signals and follow the movement. The business is not running on the structure you documented, but on the pathways people keep using because the official ones lack enough clarity and speed. Once you see that pattern clearly, you will recognize the organization that looks well-structured from the outside but feels surprisingly slow from the inside. The well-structured, slow organization. Let me make this concrete with a pattern I've seen more than once in a large organization of over 5,000 people. This company had strong Microsoft 365 adoption, clear governance language, and a leadership team that felt confident in their digital strategy. If you walked in cold and looked only at the formal layer, you would probably call the environment mature. They had established collaboration policies and naming standards, and their SharePoint structures followed clear ownership models. Platform decisions had already been socialized and approved across the business, which meant Teams was active and sites existed for every major function. Even Power Platform was being used, and the leadership team was discussing Copilot as a logical next step for productivity rather than just a novelty. On paper, this was not an organization in chaos, and it certainly didn't look broken or immature. It looked disciplined, and that is exactly why the problem was so easy to miss. The surface told a very convincing story of coherence and digital maturity, suggesting they had already done the hard work of standardizing how people collaborate. Leadership believed that story because the evidence supporting it was real. Usage metrics were high, governance rules existed, and people knew which tools were approved for their work. There was no obvious platform rebellion or dramatic fragmentation across 10 different collaboration stacks, so from a distance it looked like a company that had moved into operational readiness. But the daily experience inside the system felt very different because work was slow. It wasn't visibly slow in a way that showed up as total inactivity, but it was slow in the way many enterprise environments are slow. Everything required extra alignment, and people kept checking with each other because decisions only moved after repeated clarification. The same issues surfaced in slightly different forms across different teams, and while documents existed, confidence in the information did not. Ownership had names on a chart, but execution kept depending on a smaller, less visible group of people who actually understood how to get things across the line. The organization had structure, but it did not have flow, and that is a critical distinction for any system builder. Once you start looking through that lens, the contradiction becomes easier to understand. The formal environment was well structured enough to create legitimacy, but it wasn't well aligned enough to actually reduce friction. People inside the system were compensating constantly, not because they were failing, but because they were the ones keeping the business moving. I remember sitting with leaders in an environment like this and hearing them say they didn't understand why things still felt so heavy. That's a revealing sentence because heaviness is usually what coordinated fragmentation feels like from the inside. You have the tools, the standards, and the policies, but you still don't have clean movement. Every outcome costs more coordination than it should, and the organization starts confusing high effort with business complexity. A process feels hard, so people assume the business is just naturally complex, but often the real issue is that the structure is asking human effort to compensate for weak interfaces and hidden dependency points. From a system perspective, that isn't maturity, it's manual stabilization. Manual stabilization can look impressive for a long time because the people inside the system become highly skilled at carrying the load. They know who to ask, where to look, and when to trust the official route versus the informal one. They know which document is technically current and which one is actually usable, so the business keeps functioning through adaptation rather than clean design. Leadership was looking at a well-structured organization while the people inside it were living in a slow one. Both views were technically true, which is what makes this pattern so important to understand. The organization was not failing in an obvious way, but it was succeeding through constant human compensation. This meant the true cost stayed hidden until you stopped looking at the surface and started watching how work actually moved through the environment. What the surface suggested. If you were part of the leadership team, the surface of this organization suggested control. No serious executive believes a 5,000-person company is perfectly frictionless, but the structural order was enough that the remaining problems looked local and manageable. The architecture deck looked clean, and there was a rational platform story that everyone could follow. Teams was for collaboration, SharePoint handled structured content, and OneDrive was for personal work, while Power Platform sat ready for workflow improvement. Security was wrapped around the environment in a way that felt considered rather than improvised, and because ownership models and decision forums existed, leadership had a reasonable basis for confidence. This was not executive blindness in a caricature sense, but something much more subtle. They were reading the environment through the signals they had been taught to trust, such as rollout success, adoption metrics, and governance compliance. Those are not meaningless signals, but they aren't enough to tell the whole story. From the surface, high usage looked like maturity, and if Teams was active across the business, that seemed like a positive indicator. If SharePoint sites were provisioned according to the standard and people weren't demanding new tools outside the approved stack, it felt like the collaboration model was working. All of this created a very specific leadership narrative about having a strong digital foundation. They believed they had standardized the environment and reduced platform chaos, making them transformation ready. That narrative is understandable, but it also hides something dangerous by treating visible order as proof of operational coherence. A clean architecture model can describe intent very well, but it cannot prove that execution is flowing through that model in the way leaders imagine. Still, the governance language was mature, and people used the right words like lifecycle, information architecture, and access control. The organization sounded disciplined because in many ways it was, but discipline at the policy layer can easily coexist with fragmentation at the behavior layer. That is the part many leadership teams miss because signals presented upward are usually about deployment, not friction. Reports show how many teams were created, how many users were active, and how many workflows were launched quarter over quarter. Those metrics tell you that the environment exists and is being used, but they do not tell you whether the organization has become easier to operate inside. If you don't ask that second question, surface maturity becomes very persuasive. In this case, leadership had every reason to think the organization was structurally healthy because the standards and tools were all there. Even the language of accountability was present, so when outcomes remained slow or repetitive, the explanation naturally drifted towards the people involved. They assumed teams needed more enablement or that managers needed to reinforce better habits. Maybe some functions were lagging in adoption, or perhaps employees were over-collaborating out of caution. All of these were plausible explanations, but notice that the structure was being assumed correct while the problem was being assigned downstream. This is a common executive move in digitally mature environments because once the formal model looks complete, friction gets interpreted as execution inconsistency. They didn't see it as evidence that the model itself might not describe how real work happens. The surface suggested a company that had already solved the hard part of platform choice and architecture stability. From that angle, the remaining work looked like simple optimization, tuning, and incremental training. When a system produces slowness, despite this level of visible maturity, the real issue is usually underneath the surface model rather than at its edges. This organization was a useful case because nothing on the surface looked irresponsible or obviously broken. Leadership confidence was not irrational, but it was certainly incomplete. What they were seeing was the designed organization, but they were not yet seeing the behavioral one. Once we shifted from surface indicators to the actual movement inside the environment, the story changed fast. If you audited your own structural resilience the same way you audit your systems, you might find that your people are working much harder than the design requires. What the behavior revealed. What the behavior revealed was much less tidy than the official organizational chart suggested. The environment wasn't chaotic in a dramatic or loud sense, nor was it obviously dysfunctional to a casual observer. Instead, it was fragmented in a very coordinated way. And that distinction matters because the organization had enough discipline to avoid a visible collapse, but lacked the structural coherence to reduce the manual effort required to keep work moving. The first thing that stood out was the Microsoft Teams pattern. There were hundreds of teams spread across functions, initiatives, and management layers, but that number alone wasn't the primary issue. The real problem was the logic underneath the structure, where channel setups were inconsistent and some teams were broad and overloaded while others sat highly specific and lightly used. Private channels kept appearing whenever cross-functional work became sensitive or politically difficult, and when decisions actually mattered, people often left the shared space entirely to move into private chats and small trusted groups. While the formal collaboration layer existed on paper, the real execution layer sat one level underneath it in the shadows. Then we looked at how content moved through the system, and this is where the friction became even easier to see. The same documents were showing up in multiple locations across SharePoint and OneDrive because teams were holding local copies they could control. They didn't trust retrieval speed or findability, and they certainly didn't trust that the shared version would remain stable long enough to work from. Nobody framed it as a lack of trust, of course, because people described it as being practical or just keeping things moving to make sure they had what they needed. Locally, that behavior made perfect sense, but across the organization it produced multiple versions of the truth because the environment wasn't giving them enough confidence to work from one authoritative source. Every new copy solved a local problem while simultaneously creating a structural one. The people patterns provided the clearest signal of all. The same few individuals kept appearing as informal checkpoints across completely unrelated processes, and these weren't always senior leaders or formal owners. These were the people who knew where things really were, who held the historical context, and who understood which version of a file could actually be trusted. That is where the operating model was actually concentrated, sitting in human dependency hubs rather than the published ownership chart. Once you saw that, the whole organization read differently, and you realized cross-team work was not progressing because the design was clean. It was progressing because people were compensating for broken interfaces in real time by carrying context and revalidating knowledge manually. Because these individuals were so good at their jobs, leadership could still believe the system itself was mostly fine. This is the trap where a functioning organization remains structurally weak because the people inside it are absorbing that weakness personally. Decisions were moving through sheer effort rather than clarity, and progress depended on repeated alignment and informal confirmation from trusted intermediaries. While the surface suggested digital maturity, the behavior revealed a business running on coordinated fragmentation. The tools and standards were in place, but the flow between people and content was not strong enough to carry execution cleanly. The real cost was hidden in the repetition of questions, file creation, and constant re-explanations. The organization felt heavy from the inside, not because people lacked commitment, but because the structure kept asking them to do work the environment should have already handled. People were manually defining ownership, preserving context, and stabilizing memory every single day. Once that became visible, the problem statement changed from a few adoption gaps to an organization that looked stable only because its people had become experts at carrying structural debt. If the real issue is coordinated fragmentation, then more activity or more governance language will not fix it. You have to reduce the need for constant checking and duplicate truth, otherwise the business keeps paying for apparent stability with invisible effort. The real problem was not chaos, it was coordinated fragmentation. I want to slow down and name this clearly because the real problem was not chaos. Chaos is easy to spot and makes executives uncomfortable very quickly because it breaks the surface story, but this organization looked controlled and disciplined. It looked like a company with standards and competent people doing serious work, which is exactly why the problem lasted as long as it did. What they had was not disorder but coordinated fragmentation, which is a very different condition. Fragmentation means the parts do not fit together cleanly, while coordination means people are working constantly to make those parts function anyway. The business still produces outcomes and projects still move, but the organization is consuming far more energy than it should just to remain coherent. Teams created coordination without shared context, and SharePoint stored content without creating authoritative knowledge. Each piece of the tech stack was useful and solved something real, but the combined environment did not reduce ambiguity enough for the organization to flow. People became the integration layer by carrying meaning across tools and repairing uncertainty in real time. Because they kept succeeding, leadership continued to believe the system was broadly working. A system that works through constant compensation is not stable in the way leaders think it is. It is stable only because the people inside it are continuously absorbing the shock, which isn't resilience, it's structural compensation. Structural compensation always has limits. Whether that limit is growth, leadership change, or the introduction of AI, eventually something puts more pressure on the environment than the people can comfortably carry, and then what looked efficient suddenly feels brittle. Many enterprises are not broken in the sense of obvious failure. They are simply overloaded with hidden coordination work and function through habit and trusted intermediaries. The business was paying for coherence manually through every duplicate file, side chat, and informal checkpoint. Once you see it that way, common transformation moves like automating a fragmented process start to look dangerous because you may just be accelerating a bad dependency pattern. If you scale Copilot into a fragmented knowledge environment, you don't necessarily create intelligence. You might just surface contradictions faster. Adding more governance on top of fragmentation often makes the visible structure cleaner, while leaving the real execution burden untouched. The wrong diagnosis always produces the wrong intervention. So if leaders think the problem is user discipline, they will just add more training. If they think the problem is insufficient collaboration, they will add more collaboration spaces, but more effort inside the same pattern only deepens the load. The work does not get lighter, it just gets heavier and then becomes normalized as the new standard. The breakthrough here was recognizing that the system looked stable only because people were carrying structural debt manually. The executive question changed from how to get people to collaborate more to why the organization required so much coordination just to stay aligned. That question changes everything. Decision latency, the cost no one sees until it compounds. This brings me to a specific business cost that usually sits right underneath everything we've discussed, and that cost is decision latency. I'm not just talking about slow decisions in the obvious sense like a board of directors taking too long to vote or a procurement cycle that everyone loves to complain about. I mean the cumulative delay between an event happening, someone finally understanding what it means, and the organization actually taking action on it. That gap sounds abstract until you look at where it actually lives in your daily workflow. It lives in the dead air between a message and a response, or the space between that response and the inevitable request for clarification. You see it in the gap between the clarification and the scheduled meeting, and then again between that meeting and the final version everyone feels safe enough to approve. This is where time simply disappears in modern organizations, and because none of these small delays look dramatic on their own, they almost never get treated like a structural failure. Instead, we treat them like normal work. A document sits for 2 hours because one person is stuck in meetings, or a manager waits until tomorrow to confirm a single number, and suddenly a day is gone. Teams will often run one more review because they aren't sure if finance saw the latest change, or they'll start a side chat to reduce risk before moving to a formal step. While no single pause looks expensive by itself, the total accumulation of these moments is devastating. That is the reality of decision latency, and the reason it matters is actually quite simple. Slow organizations rarely look slow from the inside. In fact, they usually look incredibly active and responsive. They look like groups of people who are deeply engaged, careful, and constantly coordinating every move. But if every meaningful decision has to pass through extra interpretation and social repair, then the organization is burning time in places that leadership simply does not measure well. This represents one of the biggest blind spots in enterprise performance today. Labor is easy to count, technology spend is easy to track, and program budgets are simple to audit, but the cost of delayed understanding is much harder to see. In many environments, this latency is actually the most expensive thing in the entire business. When decisions slow down, your optionality begins to shrink. A response that arrives too late isn't just neutral, it's a missed opportunity. A launch decision that takes too long can close a market window entirely, just as an approval waiting for one more clarification reduces your room to adapt later on. A commercial team working from stale information is not just slower than the competition, they are strategically weaker. That is the compounding effect at work. Decision latency isn't only about wasted minutes, it's about degraded timing, and degraded timing fundamentally changes business outcomes. Now, if you map that back to the organization we just discussed, you can see the system outcomes clearly. Team pressure creates a need for more checking, while content fragmentation creates a need for more interpretation. When you add permission drift into the mix, it creates a heavy dependency on specific people, and all three of those conditions extend the time between a signal and an action. Latency is not a separate problem. It is the business expression of the structural problems we've already been talking about. I believe leaders underestimate this because they experience the symptoms as isolated incidents. They see too many meetings, too much follow-up, or too many versions of the same document, but they don't always connect those symptoms to one underlying cost curve. The business isn't just busy, it is actively delaying itself every single hour. Over time, this environment shapes the culture. People become cautious because moving fast feels unsafe, so they stop acting on shared environments and start acting only after they get personal confirmation. They escalate issues earlier and protect themselves with more stakeholders and more notes, which feels like responsible behavior. Structurally, however, this only increases latency further. The organization effectively teaches itself that friction is a sign of professionalism, and that is a dangerous lesson to learn. Once delay is normalized as diligence, the system starts protecting the very behaviors that are slowing it down in the first place. This is where executive attention becomes critical. If leaders only ask whether the work is getting done, they miss the massive amount of drag the system creates while doing it. But if they ask a harder question, like how long it takes the organization to turn an event into a trusted action, they start seeing the business differently. They stop seeing functions and reporting lines and start seeing decision flow. That is the real performance layer of any company. The most expensive part of many enterprises is not the effort itself, but the compound cost of waiting and aligning before anyone feels safe enough to move. Once you see that, the next pattern becomes impossible to ignore because latency almost always leaves a second signal behind: rework. Rework is a structural signal, not a quality issue. Once rework starts showing up everywhere, leaders usually try to explain it using the wrong language. They call it inconsistency or quality drift, and sometimes they even blame it on weak execution or a lack of accountability. But a lot of rework in large organizations is not a quality issue first. It is a structural signal. It tells you that the organization does not hold shared context strongly enough for work to move forward once, so the work moves forward twice or three times. You see it in the obvious places first, like multiple decks created for the same leadership conversation or the same numbers being validated by 3 different teams. Requests get re-entered into different systems and approvals are repeated because the previous version was almost right but not quite trusted enough to act on. Analysis is often rebuilt by another function because they need it in their own format with their own assumptions. From the outside, this looks like thoroughness, but inside the system, it is usually structural compensation. When ownership is blurred and the source of truth is unstable, rework becomes a primary form of risk management. People do not redo work because they enjoy redundancy. They redo it because the environment does not give them enough confidence to act on what already exists. This is the key shift in perspective. Rework is often the cost of low trust. That might be low trust in the data, the handoff, or the previous team's interpretation of the goals. So each function adds another layer of review or another local validation step, and every added layer feels completely justified from where that specific team sits. That is why rework is so persistent. It is locally rational, but globally expensive. I've seen organizations where the same strategic narrative is rebuilt in marketing, sales, and operations before it ever reaches the executive team. This doesn't happen because the people are careless, but because no one believes one shared version can survive the process with enough clarity to be reused safely. That is not a storytelling problem. It is an infrastructure problem. The organization cannot preserve meaning across its own boundaries, so meaning has to be regenerated over and over again. This matters because most transformation programs don't measure this well at all. They measure outputs like milestones completed or workflows launched, but they rarely measure how much duplicated effort was required underneath those outputs just to make them possible. The program looks productive on paper, while the operating environment keeps consuming energy through constant repetition. This is exactly why rework survives so many transformation efforts. The visible layer of the business improves, but the hidden friction layer stays perfectly intact. Once people learn that repetition is the safest way to operate, the behavior becomes part of the culture. Teams start protecting themselves with extra checkpoints, and managers ask for one more pass before a release. Functions will even maintain private trackers, even when a central system exists, making everyone a little more cautious and a little less willing to trust shared outputs. That is how rework becomes normalized as a sign of professionalism and good governance. But what's actually happening is the organization is teaching people that first-pass work is never enough. It's not because the people are weak, but because the surrounding structure does not reliably carry confidence forward through the workflow. Every team adds its own structural compensation, and those compensations eventually stack on top of each other. That creates slower delivery and lower clarity, even while the organization appears careful and mature. This is why I would never dismiss rework as just a quality issue. Quality language makes it sound like a failure at the team level, but a systems view asks a different question entirely. It asks what conditions are producing the need to redo or revalidate this work downstream. If the answer is unstable ownership and fragmented knowledge, then no amount of pressure on individuals will ever solve it. You have to change the environment that keeps making repetition feel safer than reuse. Once you see rework through that lens, another pattern becomes much easier to understand. You start to see why so much important work escapes the official process entirely and starts living in side files and personal trackers. And shadow systems are the real process map. That brings us to the reality of shadow systems. Once official workflows stop matching how work actually gets done, people don't sit around waiting for the governance model to catch up. They root around it. This is one of the most reliable behaviors you will see in any organization, because if the formal path is too slow, unclear, or risky, people will build a parallel path to get their jobs done. Usually these workarounds appear quietly and pragmatically for very good reasons. A private spreadsheet pops up to track project status because the official system doesn't show enough context, or a personal OneNote becomes the real decision log because nobody trusts the formal meeting notes. You might see a side team's chat become the actual approval lane because the documented process takes too long, or someone builds a small Power Automate flow for their department because waiting for an enterprise-wide workflow would kill their momentum. This is how shadow systems grow, and they don't start as an act of rebellion. They start as an adaptation. This distinction matters because leaders often talk about shadow IT or shadow AI as if these are acts of non-compliance that need to be corrected through more control. While control is sometimes necessary, if you look closely, shadow behavior is usually diagnostic of a deeper structural issue. It tells you the formal environment is not carrying the operational load people needed to carry.
The people inside the system are doing exactly what high-performing individuals always do by protecting throughput and preserving clarity.
They are reducing uncertainty locally when the broader structure cannot do it reliably, which means from a system perspective, shadow systems are not just noise at the edge, they are the real process map. These workarounds show exactly where the documented process stopped being useful and where actual execution had to invent a substitute. That substitute might be messy, risky, or create data fragmentation, but the reason it exists is the most important part of the story. It exists because the organization had a gap between the prescribed flow and the executable flow, and people filled that gap manually. Once you start reading shadow systems this way, they become incredibly revealing for any leader. Every private tracker tells you the official tracker was insufficient, and every local spreadsheet tells you the shared system lacked the trust, speed, or usability required to function. Every side conversation that becomes operationally critical tells you the main collaboration layer failed to hold enough clarity for the team. This is valuable information because you cannot eliminate shadow behavior sustainably without fixing the conditions that produce it. If you ban the spreadsheet, people will just create another one, and if you close one private workaround, the work will simply escape somewhere else. Demand does not disappear just because governance wins the argument, and the need that created the workaround is still there. This is the same mistake many transformation programs make when they see the shadow layer and try to remove it before understanding why it exists. The shadow layer is often where the organization is telling the truth about its daily operations. While the documented process says this is how work moves, the shadow layer says this is how work actually survives. And that difference is everything. I've seen organizations with beautifully documented workflows that looked complete in a PowerPoint deck but functioned completely differently in reality. The real movement happened in side notes, trusted chats, and personal escalation paths that never appeared in the official diagram. So when leaders ask why people don't follow the process, the better question is what the process is failing to provide. Does it lack clarity, speed, context, or trust? If the system cannot provide those things at the point of work, people will build structural compensation around it until that compensation becomes the actual operating model. This is also why shadow AI is rising so fast today. If the approved environment cannot answer quickly enough or structure knowledge clearly, people will reach for external intelligence because the work still has to move. The shadow layer keeps expanding wherever formal design and operational need diverge. If you want the real map of your organization, don't just inspect the approved workflow. Inspect what people built next to it, because that is where execution is telling you what the formal system could not carry. Why so many transformations fail even with good technology? This is exactly why so many transformation programs disappoint even when the technology itself is high quality. The tools are not usually the main problem, but the problem is that organizations keep trying to modernize the visible layer while leaving the hidden operating model untouched. They automate broken workflows and digitize ambiguous ownership. Then they're surprised when the new platform produces cleaner screens but not cleaner execution. That pattern shows up again and again in large companies. A company rolls out a new platform, the migration succeeds, and the dashboards look promising to leadership. But the daily experience of work barely changes because people are still chasing context, duplicating information, and relying on informal approvals to get anything done. The technology lands, but the operating drag remains exactly where it was before. The reason for this is that large programs usually start from the documented organization rather than the behavioral one. They assume the process map is true and that the formal workflow is the actual workflow. But if the real organization is running on hidden dependencies and shadow systems, then the transformation is being layered onto a false map. From a system perspective, that is not just inefficient, it is fragile. You are investing in technical change without first understanding the environment the change has to pass through. We don't need to dramatize this because there are enough examples of ERP programs that disrupted operations or platform rollouts that actually increased the process burden on employees. The same structural lesson shows up every time. Good technology cannot compensate for weak organizational design. Technology is precise, and it forces assumptions into workflows and data structures. If those assumptions are wrong, the system will simply scale the wrong thing very efficiently, which is why I'm skeptical whenever a transformation story starts with features instead of flow. When leaders say they've implemented a new platform, my next question is always about what decision became easier or what dependency disappeared. Implementation is not the same as operational improvement, yet a lot of programs confuse the two by measuring deployment and training completion instead of structural health. The metric that actually matters is whether the organization now requires less compensation to function. We should be looking for less rework, less hidden ownership, and lower decision latency. If those things are not improving, the transformation may be technically successful while remaining structurally ineffective at the same time. And that sounds harsh, but it's common because most transformation efforts still treat organizations like static diagrams. Execution happens in relationships and trust patterns, and when a program ignores those realities, the people have to absorb the mismatch. They become the manual translation layer between old behavior and new technology just to keep the project looking alive. And this is also why change resistance is often misread by management. Sometimes people are not resisting the future, but they are protecting themselves from a new system that still doesn't match how work actually moves. If the transformation just digitizes confusion, people experience that as structured friction rather than progress. Leadership then concludes the problem is adoption and calls for more training or executive sponsorship. While those might be useful, if the structure is still wrong, those interventions just push harder on the same design flaw. The real lesson is that transformation fails because the behavioral model of the organization was ignored. The formal model gets modernized while the actual way people work is forgotten, and the gap between the two is where value leaks out. This is why the next wave of AI matters so much. AI will not operate on the organization you describe in your strategy decks, but it will operate on the one your data and behaviors have actually created. AI does not operate on the organization you describe, and this is where AI becomes very clarifying, because it does not operate on the organization you describe in your slide decks. It operates on the organization your environment has actually produced, and that distinction is about to matter a lot more than most leadership teams expect. When executives talk about AI readiness, they often describe intent by listing off their clear governance, their collaboration models, and their structured knowledge. They talk about role clarity and approved systems as if those things are already fully realized. That may all be directionally true, but Copilot, agents, and retrieval-based AI do not reason over what is directionally true. They reason over what is actually accessible, what is labeled, and what is currently sitting in your data stores. AI does not meet your strategy deck first. Instead, it meets your operating residue. And that is where the real issue begins. If your SharePoint environment contains 5 different versions of the same narrative, the AI has no way of knowing which one reflects executive intent unless the surrounding structure makes that clear. If permissions have drifted over time, the AI simply inherits that reality rather than fixing it. If sensitive information is broadly accessible because your access design was never cleaned up, the AI does not correct that structurally but rather respects the mess it finds. When ownership is unclear or metadata is weak, the AI cannot reconstruct the organization leaders meant to build because it only knows how to work with the one that exists. And why is that? The reason is that AI in Microsoft 365 is grounded in the Microsoft Graph, which means it relies on content stores, access boundaries, and the simple fact of what the environment can expose at the moment of interaction. It is not sitting above the mess as some wise interpreter that understands your goals. It is downstream of the mess, which means every unresolved design weakness in your infrastructure becomes a permanent part of the AI experience. Messy SharePoint environments lead to unstable grounding, and permission drift leads to risky visibility, while conflicting files inevitably lead to uncertain answers. When ownership of data is weak, the result is a lack of trust in the outputs the AI provides. Once those problems surface, leaders often misread the situation and claim the AI is underperforming. Sometimes that is true, but very often the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just not designed for what leaders think they bought, and that line matters because disappointment with Copilot is often just disappointment with organizational structure surfacing through a new lens. The model is not hallucinating your governance problem into existence. It is simply encountering the one that was already there. A user asks a simple question and the answer comes back vague or unexpectedly exposed, which isn't always an AI quality issue, but rather a knowledge architecture problem. Now, map that back to the systems we've already discussed. Teams pressure tells you where coordination is unstable, and content duplication shows you where knowledge is unreliable, while permissions reveal where actual control sits. AI consumes the combined output of those conditions, so if the organization runs on coordinated fragmentation, the AI will not magically convert that into coherence. It will actually amplify that fragmentation at machine speed while using a much more convincing interface. That is why some organizations feel underwhelmed by their early results, not because the technology lacks value, but because they are trying to scale intelligence on top of deep ambiguity. From a system perspective, AI is not just a productivity layer, it is a structural exposure layer. It reveals whether your environment has enough clarity, trust, and authority designed to support machine-assisted reasoning in the first place. If those elements are present, the AI feels useful almost immediately. But if they are missing, the AI becomes a mirror. It might be a very expensive mirror, but it still shows you exactly what is broken, from stale content and overshared files to disconnected folders and invisible dependencies. This moment is so important for leaders because AI is ending the era where organizations could rely on people to manually compensate for structural flaws. Humans are actually quite good at reading around a bad file structure or remembering which person to trust, regardless of what the folder says. We can patch over permission confusion with personal relationships, but AI cannot do that because it follows the environment exactly as it is built. If leaders want better outcomes, the first question is not about which model they are using. The real question is what kind of organization their data, access design, and collaboration behavior have actually created over time. Why Copilot becomes a mirror, not a solution. This brings us to the next mistake leaders make, which is buying Copilot as if intelligence can compensate for structural weakness. They act as if a better interface can fix a broken operating model or as if retrieval can somehow replace the need for clear ownership. But Copilot does not resolve those underlying conditions. It reflects them back to the user. That's why in so many organizations, Copilot becomes a mirror long before it ever becomes a multiplier for productivity. You ask it to summarize a topic and suddenly you see how many contradictory documents are floating around your system. When you ask it to find the latest thinking, you discover that latest depends entirely on which site or folder a person happened to use last. You ask it to help draft something sensitive, and suddenly access questions you ignored for years become very relevant very fast. And that is not a failure in the dramatic sense, but it is a form of exposure that shows you what your environment is capable of producing. If the underlying environment is coherent, the AI feels sharp and capable, but if the environment is fragmented, the tool feels unreliable. This is not an AI problem first. It is an operating model problem expressed through a digital assistant. Once you see it this way, common adoption issues start making a lot more sense to the leadership team. Users get vague results because the content base itself is vague, and answers feel inconsistent because the source material is full of contradictions. The tool is not inventing these weaknesses, but it is surfacing them in a way that is finally impossible to ignore. This becomes even more important when organizations move beyond a single assistant and start building domain-specific automations or functional agents. If the enterprise is already fragmented, these local AI solutions will often just optimize that fragmentation within their own silos. Sales gets one layer and HR gets another, while operations builds its own and legal slows theirs down out of caution. Each team tries to make the technology useful inside its own boundary, which is locally rational, but structurally dangerous because it creates agent sprawl. Now, the business has not just siloed knowledge, but siloed intelligence. And that is a pattern that prevents true organizational coherence. Once intelligence fragments the same way data did, the organization starts getting faster answers inside silos and much weaker results across them. That feels like progress at first, but then the contradictions show up in the form of different assumptions and different versions of the truth. Leaders often expect AI to be the thing that finally integrates the enterprise, but AI cannot integrate what the enterprise has not structurally aligned. It can accelerate retrieval and reduce the effort it takes to draft a document, but it does not replace shared operating logic. Without that logic, Copilot becomes a very efficient way to encounter the mess you already had. There is a useful executive lesson here. If the rollout feels harder than expected, don't just ask if people need more prompting skills. Ask what the friction is revealing about where your content is stale or where your ownership is weak. Those are no longer secondary cleanup questions. They are now central to the actual value of the AI. Adoption stalls when organizations try to scale intelligence without structural coherence because people lose trust the moment they hit a contradiction. Once that trust drops, usage becomes performative, where the licenses and the narrative exist, but the operating confidence is gone. Copilot becomes a mirror, not because that was the promise, but because that is the environment it entered. To understand what leaders can actually do about this, we have to look at how the shift actually starts. It doesn't start with a new org chart, but with tracing one real path through the system to see where the structure is failing. What changed in the case organization? So what actually changed for them? It wasn't the org chart or the governance handbook, and they didn't start with a massive new technology investment either. Instead, they began somewhere much less glamorous but far more useful by picking one real decision path and following it from start to finish. That choice matters because when leaders try to diagnose an entire organization at once, they usually end up stuck in abstraction. You get too many workshops, too many categories, and far too much corporate language that doesn't actually describe reality. This team did something better by choosing a decision that people recognized as important, recurring, and consistently heavier than it should have been. Then they mapped where that decision actually moved, not where the policy said it moved, but where it really traveled through the system. They looked at who got involved, which team spaces were used, and exactly where files were created or copied. They identified who paused the flow, who unblocked it informally, and where people stopped trusting the shared environment to shift into private coordination. Once they did that, the organization became visible very quickly, not in theory, but in a clear sequence of actions. That changed the conversation immediately, because leadership could finally see that what looked like one process was actually a long chain of compensations. A file would be created in one place, copied to another, reworked in a third, and then approved in a chat before being stored somewhere that looked official but wasn't actually authoritative. That is a different level of truth, and once that truth is visible, blame starts losing its usefulness. The people were not the problem here, but the structure was simply asking too much from them. Because of that, the intervention became architectural rather than motivational, focusing on the system instead of trying to inspire the staff. First, they reduced duplication at the points where it was creating downstream uncertainty, but they didn't do it by announcing a stop making copies policy. That never works, so they clarified which location was authoritative for which kind of work and made that clarity operational through visible owners and expectations. That sounds basic, and it is basic, but in fragmented environments, simple clarity creates a disproportionate amount of relief. Second, they simplified the collaboration patterns around the decision itself. By merging some teams' spaces and retiring unnecessary channels, they pulled some conversations back into shared spaces where it made sense, not because public is always better than private, but because too much work had slipped into hidden paths by default. They weren't trying to force transparency as an ideology, but were simply trying to reduce the number of places where execution could disappear. Third, they identified the hidden owners and stopped pretending the formal owner model was enough. This was one of the most important shifts because once it became clear that certain people were acting as dependency hubs, leadership had to choose between relying on heroics or redesigning the system. They chose to redesign, so responsibilities were clarified and access paths were cleaned up to redistribute context. This ensured the organization didn't keep depending on the same small set of people to preserve continuity, which improved resilience immediately. Every hidden owner is a single point of failure waiting to matter, so they started measuring the right things like handoffs, delays, and version proliferation. That changed the leadership lens from asking if people were using the platform to asking if the system required less compensation than before. The results followed that shift as decision latency dropped materially and rework went down because fewer parallel truths were circulating. Ownership became easier to recognize, and people spent less time checking with the same few individuals before they felt comfortable moving forward. The organization did not become frictionless, which wasn't the point anyway, but it did become much more legible. Once a system becomes legible, it also becomes easier to improve without exhausting the people inside it. And that is exactly what changed in this organization. They stopped managing an imagined company and started redesigning around the one their own behavior had already revealed. Step 1. Map one decision end to end. If you want to do this in your own organization, don't start with a maturity assessment or a governance review. Definitely don't start by asking 10 different teams to describe how collaboration should work, but instead start with one real decision. You need something that matters enough to expose the structure around it, like a budget approval, a hiring decision, or a product launch sign-off. Anything with visible stakes and recurring friction will work because one real decision contains almost everything you need to see about your system. It shows you where authority actually sits, where knowledge gets recreated, and where people stop trusting the formal process to start compensating. This gives you a bounded way to inspect the business without trying to boil the ocean, which is a trap leaders often fall into. They ask how decisions work in general, but that question is far too broad to be useful for system design. What you want instead is to take one decision that everyone says should be straightforward but somehow never is, and trace it from the trigger to the outcome. You need to know what started it, who was supposed to be involved, and who actually ended up doing the work. You have to find which tool held the first version where the second version appeared, and exactly when someone left the shared space to move into a private thread or a side call. That is your real map, not a formal diagram or an official workflow, but the actual path of movement through your infrastructure. While you do this, you need to separate 4 things very clearly so the structure doesn't get flattened into a generic list of stakeholders. First, identify the formal approvers named in policy, and then find the practical influencers that everyone checks with before anything moves. Third, look for the dependency hubs who hold the context or history others need. And finally, mark the delay points where the process slows down or loops. If you don't separate those roles, you'll miss the reality that the formal approver may not be the real decision maker at all. The visible owner might not be the person who can actually unblock the work, and the most important dependency might sit 3 layers away from the formal chain. Now map that to Microsoft 365 in a very practical way by looking at where the decision begins and where the working documents are edited. You need to see which team's chat carries the real alignment conversation and who gets tagged publicly versus who gets contacted privately.
These details matter because they convert leadership opinion into observable system behavior that you can actually measure.
Once you have that map, don't try to optimize it yet, but just look at what the path reveals about your operating model. Most organizations learn a lot before they change anything because they realize the process is longer and more people are involved than they ever thought. They see that information gets restated constantly and that the actual decision moves through trust and memory rather than a straight line. That insight alone is powerful because the conversation changes from blaming people for being complicated to asking why the environment requires so much translation work. That is a much better executive question, and I recommend you stay disciplined by doing this with only one decision at a time. If you do it properly, one decision gives you a complete slice through the operating model where you can see collaboration pressure and permission friction. You will see the latency and the rework, which means one mapped decision is often enough to reveal the system outcomes you've been calling people problems. Step 1 isn't a workshop exercise, but an organizational X-ray where you pick one decision and trace it from end to end. Don't ask whether the process looks reasonable on paper, but ask whether the path people actually follow is evidence of clarity or evidence that the organization only survives by compensating for itself. Step 2, trace data movement and version creation. Once you've mapped out how a decision actually happens, you need to trace the data that the decision relies on. This is usually the part of the process where things start to feel a little uncomfortable for leadership. Most organizations claim they have a formal decision-making process, but if you look at the mechanics, what they actually have is a content movement pattern. The decision doesn't just travel through a chain of people. It migrates through a messy trail of files, drafts, slides, and notes. You'll see it move through approvals, copies, exports, and attachments, sometimes even living in grainy screenshots sent over chat. Every single one of these movements is a data point that tells you something specific about structural trust within the company. Instead of just asking where a document is located, you should ask where it started and where it was copied. You need to find the exact moment people stopped trusting the previous version enough to keep working in the same place. That is the real question you're trying to answer. If a file starts in a shared Teams library but gets downloaded to a desktop, edited in private, and then emailed as an attachment, you aren't looking at collaboration, you are looking at compensation. The team might still call it teamwork, but structurally, it means the environment has failed to maintain enough confidence for the work to stay in one place. This is why version creation is such a massive tell. Every time someone creates a new version of a file, they are making a small design confession about the system. It tells you that a human being needed more control, more speed, or more protection than the official system was providing them at that moment. Now, I'm not saying that every duplicate file is a sign of a broken culture. Sometimes a copy is perfectly legitimate, like when a template is reused or a specific snapshot is needed for a legal audit. The issue isn't that duplication exists, but rather whether duplication has become the primary way the organization creates a sense of certainty. When every important decision generates 5 near-identical versions across SharePoint, OneDrive, and email, knowledge isn't being shared. It is being recreated through constant movement, and that creates a massive downstream cost for the business very quickly. First, nobody is ever quite sure which version is the truth, and second, ownership starts to blur because every local copy feels like it belongs to the person who saved it. Third, the whole process slows down because people have to do forensic work to validate the history of a file before they feel safe acting on it. That is the real burden on your people. It isn't a storage problem, it's an interpretation problem. Your high-value employees are spending their time playing detective just to answer the simple question of which file is the real one. Now, map that reality to your business outcomes. If your leadership team is making big bets based on content with an unstable history, your strategic clarity is much weaker than that polished reporting deck suggests. If your commercial teams are rebuilding the same analysis in 3 different folders, the organization is consuming intelligence over and over instead of letting it compound. When a tool like Copilot enters this kind of environment, it simply inherits all that existing ambiguity. The AI doesn't inherently know which file is the one you actually mean if the environment hasn't made that distinction clear through actual operations. In this step, I want you to get very concrete with your observations. Take the decision you mapped out earlier and follow the trail of the supporting content from start to finish. Look at where the first version was created, who touched it next, and exactly when that second or third copy appeared. Pay close attention to the file names. When you see labels like final v2 or use this one, you are seeing people try to encode trust manually because the platform failed to do it structurally. You should also look for instances of recreation where the same summary is rebuilt in PowerPoint because the Word version was too messy to use. When the same answer has to be regenerated in multiple places, the organization is telling you that its information architecture is failing to support execution. Data movement reveals your true organizational boundaries much more honestly than any policy document ever could. Where content is copied, trust is weak, and where the version count explodes, your alignment is likely non-existent. Step 2 isn't just an administrative content audit, it is a diagnostic tool for your entire operating model. Follow the file, count the versions, and notice exactly where the confidence breaks down. The moment data has to keep moving just to stay usable, the organization is showing you exactly where its structure has stopped carrying the weight of the work. Step 3. Find hidden owners and measure friction. After you've traced the decision and followed the data trail, the next layer of the system becomes much easier to see. You can finally identify who actually owns the movement of work. I'm not talking about who has the title on the org chart, but who owns it operationally. Most organizations are surprised by what they find here. The real structure usually centers around a few specific people who don't look central on paper but are indispensable in practice. And these are the people everyone checks with before they hit send on a draft or a proposal. They are the ones who know if a specific number is safe to use or which version of a plan is politically acceptable this week. Sometimes they are managers, but often they are long-tenured specialists or executive assistants who carry the institutional memory that the official system never bothered to capture. These are your hidden owners. They aren't hidden because they're invisible. They're hidden because the formal design of the company doesn't admit how much it depends on them to function. This matters because in any system, dependency is the same thing as power. If one person is the only one who can unblock or interpret work, then that person is your real governance model. This isn't a knock on those individuals, as they are usually the ones holding the whole place together, but from a systems perspective, they represent a single point of failure. To find them, you just have to ask a few simple questions. Before a project moves forward, who does everyone feel the need to check with? If a specific person goes on vacation, does the work actually stop? You are looking for the people who are carrying the context that the system should have made visible a long time ago. Once you have that map of hidden ownership, you need to pair it with friction measurement. Insight is great, but without measurement, it's too easy for a leadership team to ignore. You don't need a complex analytics suite for this. You just need to track a few honest signals. Start by counting the handoffs. Look at how many times a piece of work moves between different people or tools before it's actually finished. You should also measure the delay between those steps. focusing on the dead time where the work is just sitting there waiting for the next person to act. Count the versions, the clarifications, and how often the same 2 or 3 people appear as validators at every single stage. That is your friction. Friction isn't just a minor inconvenience for your staff. It is literal energy being drained from the company to compensate for a weak structure. If a single decision requires 9 handoffs and 4 different versions, the problem isn't that your people need to collaborate harder. The problem is that the environment you've built requires too much manual effort just to keep things coherent. That is a system outcome, not a personal failing of the team. When you make this visible, the conversation with executives changes instantly. You're no longer complaining that a process feels slow. Instead, you are pointing out that a decision requires 12 transfers of context and depends entirely on 2 hidden owners. That kind of language is architectural and measurable, which makes the problem feel fixable. You don't need to buy new software to do this. You just need the discipline to watch how your current environment is actually behaving. Once you see the friction and the hidden owners, the imagined version of your company loses its power, and you can finally start dealing with the real one. Step 4. Simplify the environment before you scale it. Once you can finally see where the friction lives, your next move isn't to add more capability, but to remove the unnecessary complexity that's holding everything back. This is exactly where most organizations get the sequence wrong because they see delays, duplication, and workaround behaviors and try to fix them by adding another layer. They throw another workflow at the problem, or maybe another dashboard, another AI use case, or a new governance step to control the mess they already created. But if the underlying environment is already fragmented, scaling it just spreads that fragmentation faster across the entire company. You have to simplify the environment before you try to scale it, which sounds obvious, but it rarely actually happens in the real world. Simplification doesn't look as exciting as a massive digital transformation, and it certainly doesn't photograph well on a roadmap or sound ambitious during a steering committee meeting. From a system perspective, however, simplifying is often the most strategic thing a leadership team can do for long-term health. Complexity compounds operationally, meaning every extra team, duplicate channel, and unclear permission layer adds one more place where your context can split apart. When that context splits, the people inside the system have to reconnect the dots manually, and that manual labor is the hidden tax on your productivity. Your job here is to reduce the number of places where work can drift away from the center, so start by looking at your collaboration spaces. Do you really need all of them? I'm not asking if they should exist theoretically, but whether they serve a purpose operationally that justifies the noise they create. How many team spaces are carrying overlapping work, and how many channels only exist because no one wanted to challenge an old broken structure. We often see private channels become permanent fixtures because trust and clarity were never fixed in the shared space, but you shouldn't try to centralize everything into one giant swamp either. You are trying to remove the unnecessary branching that creates confusion without adding any meaningful value to the business. And then you need to do the exact same thing with your content and documentation. How many different places can a document live before it's considered official? And how many libraries hold overlapping material with slightly different versions of the truth? Many people still rely on personal storage because the shared environment feels too noisy or politically unreliable. So simplification means choosing authoritative locations and making them socially real. If a decision document lives in one specific folder, then that is where it lives. And if a team knowledge base belongs in a certain spot, then the ownership stays there too. When something gets archived, it should stop competing with active work as if it still belongs in the current flow of the day. That kind of clarity reduces the mental work of interpretation immediately, and the same logic applies to your permission structures. Most organizations carry layers of historical access they no longer understand, like project access that never expired, or groups that grant visibility long after the purpose is gone. Access complexity eventually becomes organizational complexity, and if nobody understands who can see or approve what, then confidence in the system starts to drop. When confidence drops, checking behavior rises, which is why simplification must include reducing permission ambiguity through clear owners and boundaries. Control isn't the goal here, clarity is. Simplification isn't just cosmetic cleanup work, but a fundamental shift in your operating model design, and that is how leaders need to frame it. If you remove duplicate stores and clarify your sources, you aren't just tidying up a platform, you are changing the conditions under which decisions happen. You are lowering the amount of structural compensation your people have to provide, and that is high-level executive work. There is another layer to this because simplification creates the conditions for true resilience. Fragile organizations don't usually break because they lack activity. They break because too much depends on too many unclear parts that only a few people understand. One person knows where the real file is, one team knows which channel matters, and one manager knows which copy is actually trusted. That isn't a sign of organizational maturity. It's a massive concentration risk that threatens the whole system. As you simplify, you should build redundancy where it matters, but I don't mean redundancy as duplication. I mean redundancy as structural resilience. You want more than one person to understand the path and more than one role to be able to move the work forward in a governed way. This reduces single points of failure without increasing the general chaos of the office, and that distinction is vital for growth. A lot of organizations think they have redundancy when they actually just have uncontrolled duplication, but duplication creates confusion, while redundancy creates safety. One of these weakens your execution, while the other protects it from the unexpected. If you want to simplify before you scale, don't ask how to roll out more, ask what structural compensation you can remove first. Which team spaces no longer serve a clear decision path, and which content locations are still creating parallel versions of the truth. You need to find which permission structures no longer reflect your business reality and which hidden owners need their context redistributed so the system can survive without heroics. Once leaders start doing that work, technology stops acting like a layer placed on top of the company and starts becoming an expression of its actual logic. The environment becomes cleaner, more legible, and far less dependent on individual memory or workaround behavior. That is the only point where scale becomes truly useful, because scaling a simplified environment is a completely different animal than scaling a fragmented one. In one case, you are amplifying clarity, but in the other, you are just amplifying confusion with better tools. The organization you manage isn't the one described by your structure alone. It's the one produced by behavior and movement inside your systems every day. Conclusion: most leaders are not actually managing the organization they think they are managing. They are managing a formal description of it, like an org chart, a governance model, or a transformation narrative that sounds good in a slide deck. All of those things are useful and necessary, but they are still incomplete because the organization that determines your speed and trust is the one produced by behavior. You can see the real enterprise in the message patterns, the duplicated files, the hidden owners, and the side channels where work actually gets done. It lives in the places where work slows down or escapes the official path just to survive the day, and that is the real business, not the imagined one. This matters more now because AI and Copilot are removing our ability to stay abstract about these structural failures. For years, the people inside your organization have been carrying the gap manually by remembering what the system forgot and knowing which version of a file was safe. They knew who to ask and which workflow actually worked, acting as a form of human structural compensation that kept things moving. That is why many businesses looked more coherent than they really were, because your people were absorbing the design weaknesses for you. That kind of manual compensation doesn't scale forever, and it definitely doesn't scale into an AI-enabled operating model. AI doesn't work from your assumptions or your org chart. It works from the environment you've actually built. The next phase of digital maturity isn't about buying more tools, it's about having more honesty regarding how decisions really move through your system. You need visibility into how knowledge holds together and how much of your current performance depends on individual heroics instead of structural resilience. If you audited your organization the same way you audit your technical systems, what would you actually find when you looked under the hood? Would you find a business designed to sustain performance, or one that quietly drains it through friction that no dashboard currently names? That is the real work now, and it goes far beyond just deploying more capability. It requires seeing the operating reality clearly enough to stop confusing coordination effort with actual organizational coherence. If this changed how you see structure and behavior, leave a review for the podcast so the right people can find these conversations. If you want to continue this with me directly, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. The organization you manage is not defined by its structure, it is defined by the behavior inside your systems.